Today in 365 Days of Psychology, or Psych365, we are going to be talking about some common myths relating to psychology. So remember, this series is loosely based upon the book 365 Days of Psychology by Day Lee, which came out in 2024. So we are on day 6. And there are a lot of myths about psychology. Some of them are based upon previous research evidence that we have found to be incorrect. Some of them are just based upon assumptions of people who do not know a lot about psychology. And this is why continued research is so important. We need to know what people believe, first of all, and then we need to test it to make sure if, what people think is common sense is really all that common. Um, so what are some examples, my favorite examples of the myths about psychology? The first one, psychology is not just about mental health. It's not, but you knew that. So the myth is that psychology is only about mental health. I don't know how many people I've met that, when I talk about that I'm a psychologist, they're like, oh, so do you like help clients and stuff? And I'm like, no, no, I am a teacher, but I have lots of friends who do lots of different things with psychology that don't involve being a counselor. Another myth that falls into this area is that psychologists can read your mind. That is not the case either. There's no class that we take on mind reading. Another myth out there is about birth order and how it affects your personality. So basically, if you were born as a middle child, then you behave in a certain way. So we know that personality is not shaped by when in the family we were born. Now, can it be shaped by how the parents treat each child differently based upon how old the parents are when they have that child, or whether or not they felt that they did a good job with their first child, or whether or not there are sex differences in terms of the children? Sure. Is it possible that, the parents change their parenting over time, and so the youngest child is parented differently? Sure. But being first, second, or third doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be, that your personality is going to be coming out different. Um, Another myth is that you are either left-brained or right-brained. We do not have a dominant hemisphere in our brain. Our brain works entirely together. And so while you may be more artistic, or you may be more into literature, these do not indicate that you are more of a left-brained or a right-brained person. Um, Another one that is interesting is people believe that our memories are pretty much like a recorder, and that is not the case at all. Your memory does not work like a brain recorder. Your memory is valuable, and it sometimes puts things in that didn't actually happen, or it can give you memories for things that you weren't actually there for. So no, your memory is not a 100% brain recorder. Um, Learning styles. There's been a lot of discussion about tailoring education to learning styles. And we do know that while students may have learning preferences, so for example, they may learn best through reading, they may learn best through, or they may feel that they learn best through audio, things like that. As teachers, as college faculty, we should be differentiating our instruction to the point where all students should be able to find a way that works for them in terms of how to learn most effectively. Um, some people believe that there are like one gene for depression. That's not the case. In all mental disorders and all physical disorders, there are going to be multiple genes that are working together to influence our behaviors and mental processes. So even if we're talking about skin tone, even if we're talking about nail hardness, all of those are influenced by multiple things, not just by a gene. Um, There's been some discussion about stages of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a lot about stages of grief, and how the stages that we go through as we are grieving. There's very little research that actually indicates that she was correct, although we do know that people can generally go through the same sort of stages, but that does not mean that every single person is going to go through a set, stage in terms of their grieving process. Grieving is individual for every individual. And so we cannot tell people that, like, oh, well, the next stage that you'll go through is this, because that might not be true or probably isn't true for that person. Another thing that's been receiving a lot of media attention recently is attachment styles. And my students come in with all of these thoughts about attachment styles, and they want to do their papers on attachment styles and how attachment styles in childhood influence adult attachment styles in relationships. And while we do know that the attachment or experience of parenting or guardianship that we had as a child can influence our personality, that does not mean that it is set in stone, and that if you were anxiously attached to your primary caregiver in childhood, that you will grow up to be an anxiously attached adult. That is not necessarily the case. We do know that there's lots of potential things that can happen, such as having a caregiver who helps us to develop a more secure attachment, going through counseling to develop a more secure attachment. There's lots of things that can change between early childhood and adulthood that can change how we feel about attachment towards relationships. Another one that I hear often is that humans only use 10% of their brain. Again, that is a myth. That is incorrect. We use our whole brain. Now, we may not be using every single neuron at the same time, but one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that parts of your brain are not focused on the thinking that you recognize your brain is there for. So, for example, in our brain stem, we have lots of bits of the brain that are making sure that you stay alive. And if those had to be cognitive, like if you had to think about breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, uh, you wouldn't be able to do anything else. And so while our brain is working, we may not recognize that all of it is working at the same time because of the fact that we don't think of those specific parts of the brain as actually working. And then probably this whole talk has reminded you that psychology is not just common sense. I don't know how many times I've talked to people and they're like, well, what do you teach in a psychology class? Like, psychology is just common sense. I'm like, I think you should take a psychology class so that you can recognize that that is not the case. So we need to do research on what people believe are common pieces of knowledge or what would be considered common sense to recognize whether or not that information is correct. And I think to myself that common sense, if you break it down into two words, common meaning that it applies to everyone, sense would be knowledge. There's no knowledge that every single person in the world has. And so there's, even if you could come up with one or two things, that would make common sense very small in terms of the knowledge bank of humans. So today in Psychology 365, we talked about some myths related to psychology. Come back tomorrow and we'll talk some more.